wonderful experience. I know I had never experienced Nashville Lads. I just experienced Lads in Louisville, which is tiny. The people competing in song leading were me, my twin, and then another set of twins. So it was nothing like the 4 separate ballrooms of rewards, but it was great. And to see the kids was wonderful too. It's been a crazy week at school with the ACT. We had them testing on Tuesday. Luckily, I just had to stare into darkness for 4.5 hours. Nothing bad happened, but still. It's been a lot. And it's crazy to think we're this far into this quarter. We only have one more. Well, this is technically our last go-around. We just happen to have an extra one afterwards in May. So we'll be creative with the Beatitudes about that. But before we get into this for tonight, do we have any prayer requests specifically?
My cousin passed away this morning.
Sorry to hear that.
He was 30 with 2 kids. Wow. Got the phone call this morning. My dad did, so it's been a really rough day for our family, and especially his wife and children.
Absolutely.
So we're kind of waiting to see the Swindle family.
Swindle. Okay. Matt, do you have any update on your friend whose infant passed?
Good, just keep them in your prayers.
Okay.
They seem to be straight with actually no more. How are they?
They're just making it day by day. Yeah.
For sure.
Different transition. Still
Yeah.
pretty tough on them though.
Absolutely. What family is that again?
It's
Smiths and the Swindles. Okay. Zach?
My dad was in the ER today. He's okay now, but he's in shock.
Okay. Anything else? I know. Definitely.
Corey Coonfield's dad
Yes.
is he's in and out of the hospital
Okay.
a lot with kind of like chronic health issues. So it's been going on for a while. But just keep him in your prayers tonight. He just got out. I think it was yesterday. Again, and it's just kind of been in and out for a long time. So
For sure. All right. Well, I know I definitely appreciate your prayers with everything I'm bouncing with school and master's work, Bible class, and also as Lexi and I prepare to get married as well. There's way too many decisions that you think don't matter, but that like you had we've got to make a decision about them, so they ultimately matter. There's a lot to deal with, but I would cover your prayers on that too. But let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we are grateful for the opportunity to come together. We just ask at this time you help us to lay aside the cares and the worries and the burdens that surround us in our lives and that make up our physical life here on earth. We just ask that you help us as we come to come before your throne and to study your word, that you aid us in opening our hearts and our minds to listen and to just focus on those things and let your word speak to the parts of our lives that we need it to, and to your love and your grace and your mercy for those things to show through your word tonight. We thank you for this study and ask you to help us as we go through it to take something that we can use in our lives and that can help us grow closer to you. We just ask you to please be with the Swindle family and the Smiths as they're both suffering loss. Just grief and unexpected loss are things that are so hard to deal with, and we know they are not things that go away quickly, and that the hurt will never truly leave. But we just ask that you be with those families and give them the comfort and the peace that only you and your Spirit can grant. We just ask you to be with Corey's dad and Zach's dad as well, with their health, and help it to improve and for their situations to get better and to put a healing hand upon them, God. We're grateful for your son who has given us not just a reason to live, but for a reason to hope and to go through each day. And we thank you so much for him. It's in his name that we pray. Amen. All right, let me make sure this is all good. I use my mouse right-handed most of the day, but I am left-handed, so. All right. So we're almost to the end of this quarter of coming on to the Mount of Beatitudes to study at the feet of Jesus. And it is a interesting, it parallels a lot of what Danny spoke about last week, but we're not going to to rehash everything there. He did an excellent job, and we had a wonderful and I think a fruitful discussion on persecution as well last week in the midst of the Beatitudes. But I just hope that we can kind of get sucked into this picture and sit on the hill at the feet of Jesus and to listen to the words that he has to say. This week's text, which there are verses in here I will ask you all to read, so I guess have your either finger ready to scroll and click or your thumb ready to flip through them pages. But our beatitude this week, it's 2 verses. It's a big thing, I know. I don't know if we'll be able to get through both of them. But it says, "Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you." Now, this is different because it doesn't really follow, and this is the end really of what he's saying for the Beatitudes, but it doesn't follow the same format as the other ones. And when I looked also at what it looks like in the Greek, it normally says what's right here, makarios, it says hoi makarios, which is supposed to be like, blessed are those, or blessed are the poor in spirit, and it directly has that. This is phrased differently. It's a different structure. So I don't know what Jesus, I'm not going to try and interpret his mind and his intentions with how he phrased things or how the Spirit chose to pen these words. But it is interesting that this is a more broken out statement. And it's using a different form of blessed with the same word, but it's saying it's a present thing. If you notice, there's a lot of aspects of the Beatitudes that are all future and our characteristics. But this is an active situation that is going on that he's describing. It's not just a character trait or an attribute, whereas, you could be peacemakers or you could be poor in spirit, things that define you as a person. He is taking a very practical application to this last kind of beatitude. He said, hey, blessed are you when this occurs, when it happens. So I guess they couldn't fault him for not being, practical in his beatitudes, because he is definitely taking a step to say, hey, they're going to do this about you. But also, there's always a future action tied to the blessings in the Beatitudes. And this, though, in the second verse, which obviously the verse divisions we put there for organizational purposes, but we have this statement that finishes, and then he says, rejoice and be glad, or surely rejoice, or surely be glad, because your rewarding is great in heaven. And this is, I guess, the first time that he's kind of not just said, this will happen in the future. He's stating exactly why and what that reward will be. And obviously, we could spend an entire class just talking about how great heaven is. But let's break down into this. Now, our text, we're going to kind of separate it into three, 4-ish parts, I guess. We have the blessed part, which we've talked about. And then we have the revile and persecute you. And then lastly, the section that he has on reward. So as we're breaking this down, I want you to see it like that. And then at the end, for whatever time allows, we will look into the prophets as well, or just prophet, because we don't have that much time to look at all the prophets. But this brings me, as soon as I read this verse, it brought me to the book of James, and we might close with "You have called me higher." But we know that this is a familiar verse that echoes some of the same things that is said in the Beatitudes. He says, count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, which hits on the rejoicing that Jesus was just saying, that when others revile and persecute. I would classify that as trials of various kinds. And he says, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness, and let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. This is a bold statement, obviously, and I know we go to this for many, many things. But as it ties into what Jesus is saying, it's telling us that we should be rejoicing in the face of those things. And I think that, just if we stop there, is a challenging and a hard truth to wrestle with. Because he is saying that despite these things, which we're going to talk about exactly what that means and why that's, I guess, bad, be happy, be glad, rejoice. And that's easy to say when we're at Lads to Leaders surrounded by kids who are, smiling, they're having a great time. But it's even harder when you have situations of loss, when you look at a family child to cancer, when you look at a family who just lost an infant, things, it's hard when you can say, you can look at them, you can read the scriptures and hope that it's reassuring to say, count it joy, brethren, when you fall into these various trials. That's not what we want to hear. In those hard moments, these beatitudes really get challenging when you try and put it in some of these very, very tough situations that we can find ourselves in this life. But as we break this down, and Jesus is technically hitting at some, I guess you could say, not as serious situations compared to the loss and the many sufferings we can find ourselves in. But there's encouragement in this beatitude. And that's because when we're talking about being blessed, we're talking about that happiness, or, be happy is what we titled the course. But that happiness, we're supposed to be happy about what comes next. He says our reward in heaven is great, but we're supposed to have a healthy and right perspective about that. And we're going to talk more about that as we break down the beatitude. But notice that we're supposed to be happy about what comes next. It's not saying rejoice and be glad because, man, Wednesday's a great day and it's got all the things that we wanted and all the things that we needed and exactly the comfort that we wanted it to have. There's a content channel on YouTube that Evan and I like a lot, and their motto is called "Seek is Comfort." And the idea is that on the other side of your comfort zone lies growth. And we like their content so much because they inadvertently have a lot of gospel truths tied into that. I mean, they put love over fear, which is one of my favorite verses, 1 John 4:18, and all these things that just integrate really well into, I think it's funny that it's so Christ-centered. But it was never supposed to be comfortable. And I can tell you, just as the further I get into adulthood, my priorities when I'm making decisions are, man, what decision can I make that's going to lead me to be the most content with what's going here, with what's most comfortable with going here. Maybe I don't want to go to that house because it's not going to be as comfortable because it's old, and other things might happen there, or it's not a good neighborhood. I wouldn't be comfortable living there. Those kind of things. There's no end to the amount of things that have us tied to here instead of next. And that's probably one of the most difficult parts of that. But is physical or emotional harm a blessing? It's a really weird question to ask about blessing. What's the obvious answer to this? No! We'd have a lot more issues with people looking at us as Christians if we were like, yay, yay, yes, this is what it's all about. Jesus, hurt me, both emotionally and physically. Like, if that's how we preach the gospel, people would have much better reasons to say we're not right now, okay? So we know that's not the case. Then why is Jesus saying that blessed are those that endure both physical and emotional suffering? Because that's what he said. And I think that's a beautiful point because we don't like the things that hurt, but yet cause us to grow.
They're in that. So to them, I think they're in that. We're not in that, so we don't think they slap me and beat me up. But they're in it. I think of that day that they already were there, like you had to. Maybe someday you'll get this and it'll mature, but you do get that maturity from it. You don't get it without some stuff.
No, and I mean it's a simple example to come to, but like when you think about working out in the gym, right? The only way that you're going to build muscle is by tearing your muscles to create stronger, bigger muscles. That's just how it works to build it up. You physically cannot get stronger without first harming your muscles. And like that's great to think about, but it's even harder to put into practice because we as humans have a natural desire to preserve ourselves. And even if we know that growth can come from harm, we still are going to avoid it. I mean, you look at all the nature, like how every rom-com talks about relationships. Oh, I don't want to take a chance on love again. I might get hurt. But then we know that inevitably they're only going to find their one true love if they take a chance, on a small town relationship with somebody from the city, as Hallmark I never does. But in a very real way, it takes a lot of personal awareness to understand that we're going to try and avoid this at all costs, and that will be to the detriment of our faith.
Partly too, physical and emotional during our lives. It's subjective to each person, but it's unavoidable. So, because we live in a fallen and a broken world with sin, death, we're going to endure physical and emotional health. Now, we will quantify it and say this person is obviously suffering more than this person or whatever. But, I had a preacher one time who had lost, his wife and son was murdered and stuff like that. And he said, I don't consider my suffering to be greater than somebody suffered, has much loss in his or her life, because suffering is suffering. And I think that's a part of it. It's like we're all going to endure really hard times, physically, emotionally.
Yeah.
But yeah, I hope that it produces.
And I think that quantifying thing is a big challenge for us too, because I know whether it's suffering or not, because we're not as quick to quantify all the bad things as we are to say, oh, that person's got it so much better. But then when we are suffering, we're like, woe is me. This is so much worse. And so it's interesting though that we try and do that because it really does minimize the human experience in general. Because we all, as you said, have that. Jason got and then Danny.
Pursuit of culture. Yes.
No.
In his high priestly prayer, prayed specifically that God would not take his disciples out of this world, but that he would strengthen them spiritually. Excuse me. And I think James started with the book of James. So that's written to a group of people that are totally displaced. They've moved from their homes not because they researched and got a new job for them, but because they're facing famine and persecution. So they have to rebuild a new identity, a new family life, a new vision for how their life is going to be. And the midst of that is the context for him saying to find joy in the situation, because it's producing godly character. And if you struggle, that next part he says, if you don't, if you're struggling that way, then ask God, and God will give you wisdom. He will help you to have his perspective. So I think in the midst of that, Christ. And when Jesus is the center of our pursuit, it's not, we find ourselves pursuing comfort and convenience. And when those things are established, we don't want to find those things, we're devastated. That doesn't build that spiritual resilience, that strength from Christ alone.
No, and I think that resilience is key. And I mean, if you look to anybody that's working in the education field currently with all the stuff that's going on, the lack of resilience is something in very non-serious ways, like resilience and ability to take tests. Like they can't sit down and do a lot of those things. But also the emotional resilience and things. It's incredible. And I'm sure we'll continue to live to see as our world pushes more and more convenience. We're going to be trying to produce people and make ourselves weaker as a result of that. The more we, I guess, not buy into, but I guess internalize those things as a part of ourselves, because we can definitely have a bit of it around us. It's not going to affect us. But Danny,
Your idea of quantifying really touches me right now, because I'm struggling with the way that the question is even worded. If you ask me, is it a blessing to physically or emotionally struggle? Okay, then I can say yes. But to have physical or emotional harm, and I think part of that's personal thing coming out of Agape's world.
the harm you
That
see.
means a different thing. And so, even though we say we can't, man, I think this to struggle is not as bad as harming. And that's tough. That's tough.
It is. And I think there's an even more powerful thing in there when we look, as Jason said, if Christ is the center, that though it is terrible what we can do to each other as humans, but it's even more beautiful the glory that God can bring through those things. Because when you see some of those individuals who have suffered great harm, not because of anything they've done, but then can grow and fully come out of those things, the individual that makes, not that I want harm on it, but if they have overcome those things and found Christ in that, it's beautiful what those people can do to the world because of their perspective and their heart. Because I guarantee you, if they've overcome that, they're not going to go back into that cycle and create more of that. I think was it Matt and then Hayden? Sure.
I was
Both
just
at once.
gonna say, I think ultimately when we get to heaven, I think we're gonna look back and think that anything that brought us closer to Christ was a blessing. And that's not always physical or emotional. I think about even a recent trip I took to like a hiking trip to Patagonia, and I saw some of the prettiest things I've ever seen in my life, and all that put me back to God for me. I'll never forget that, and it helped me grow in my faith. Where I've definitely seen struggle that has brought me closer to Christ, and even though it's hard to see, I think when we're all in heaven, we're all going to say that just the real question is what brings us closer to Christ, and anything that does is a blessing. But I do think also, kind of echoing what everybody else is saying, there's certainly, I think spiritually always, in almost everything in life, like struggle can lead to growth. And you even see this, I think about people who retire. It's like the ultimate goal is like to get to retirement. But if people retire and then end up just watching TV and don't have any struggle anymore, we see actually those people end up losing their lives like pretty quickly. And I also know people who are very fulfilled because they almost like work harder now that they're retired because they can do the projects that they want to do, but they're struggling in a way. But a lot of those people like throw themselves in the ministry or something like that, and they love their lives, but they're choosing that struggle. They could be sitting down and doing nothing. They have financial ability to do that, but they're much happier, much more fulfilled in that struggle.
Yeah, I know my grandfather is one of those people. He took up like wood crafting. He refurbished and resold like air guns and like lures, and he's now making sushi. He learned how to do that and staying in a rehab facility after COVID. So it was crazy. But yeah, I mean, I would say he's fulfilled. He's finds something to do with his hands. He does it.
Just reading the sentence reminds me of Romans 5, suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope. And hope does not put us to shame because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. So it's kind of just the fact that we're going through an emotional or physical harm, because we are persecuted, because we have that one sin that we just cannot get past. That is put into our lives as a means of trying to get us to see the grace of God and see that through God, through Jesus Christ, we have that opportunity to overcome that problem. And maybe flip it on its head and say, I've overcome this problem, or I have figured out a way to overcome this problem, and here's how I did it. And then you can go and be through your emotional or physical or whatever's gone in your life, and be a minister to those such that you're helping them out and helping others get over these kind of problems. And that's how you can be flip it on its head and become a blessing. Being a problem that's hurting you, being a blessing. We're also struggling with the issues of life.
I mean, I think that echoes this, that when paired with living like Christ, it is a blessing for those things. And I know, I grew up as, I guess, technically a child of divorce, you could say. And if you look at the statistics behind children of divorce, none of them are favorable. Just because one of the woman my mom is, but also because of the focus that my mom and my stepfather had on living a Christian life, I credit that to my success. I mean, and overcoming those things. And I know that like because of the life that I've lived, I could help other kids get through that kind of upbringing as well. But in we talked about it slightly. The only reason that any of the Beatitudes say blessed is because they assume you are living the way Jesus would in totality. And so that means we're trying to embody him and to live like him. Then it is a blessing to do these things. Then it is a blessing when others revile and persecute you. If you're not doing that, then you have a reason to be reviled and persecuted because we will be doing something in a way that is not, consistent with the character of Jesus. And in that, there's imperfections and there's hypocrisy and so many things. So just be aware and try and separate that there are people being evil just because we live in a fallen world, as you said. And then there's people being evil because we have chose to live like Christ. One we cannot avoid. One we choose to walk into. So we have to keep that in mind as we look through this. And so that brings us to talking about when others revile us. And how in your regular dailiness, how do you revile people? How does that manifest itself? Any takers? Not really a word used, but if you were to revile someone, what would you say? Or I guess, what would an individual who, because none of us would revile anybody, what would an individual who reviles someone do?
Why are you going 30 and a 60?
I was trying to get to church, officer. No. Yeah, I don't. Not let Lexi talk about my behaviors when driving, because I'm very critical of other people. I mean, I will say, as far as like a modern context where we see a lot of reviling and stuff and whatnot, sports, my goodness, there is a lot of that. Something so arbitrary that it generates so much hatred. And I say arbitrary in the fact that like we made those things. They're not inherent attributes of us as humans. We created all of this, and then we chose to apply a bunch of hate to it, which I understand is competition and whatnot. I often wonder if Jesus and the apostles ever like raced each other or anything, but who knows? We'll never know. Well, I guess we can ask them one day if they had races or anything. But when you revile someone, you're like the word vehement and venom come to mind for me with revile, and I guess that just comes with vile and evil. I don't know. I just think of like the nasty, awful things that you say when you are trying to hurt somebody. It's not just tearing someone down; it's maliciously tearing someone down. You come at it with just you want to hurt them, and you want to say something to bring them down and negative. And when we think about that, I know that hopefully us on a daily basis get reviled by those around us, but it is something that could be waiting for us, especially if we try and take the gospel to people. That the way that challenging someone to live their life differently comes, I mean, it's seen as an attack. I mean, we respond the same way when somebody criticizes us, even if it's just. And I know a lot of times when we snap back with some kind of mean thing like, I'm going to dig at you now that you criticize me. We take a moment to pause and we're like, they're not wrong. I just don't like it because I don't like being told that I'm wrong. And it kind of comes with these two things with it, as far as or three things, sorry: to defame, to rail at, and to chide, which is kind of to scold or rebuke. Did you have something to add with that? So to defame, to rail at, and to chide, which is interesting because one of these things, where do we see one of these words commonly coming up in our culture? There was like 2.5 weeks where this word was used a ton. Yeah. I mean, I'm sure it taught a lot of these kids what defamation was because of the Johnny Depp lawsuit. But to defame, I mean, to rail at, I don't think most people use that. To chide, that's probably a more common word than to rail at to use. Not that it's a regularly occurring word, but defame. And that led me to do a little bit of research. Apologize in advance, Sonny, if I have the law stuff. All right, I swear I was from Cornell. All right. And so when we're looking at things that satisfy defamation of character, as far as in our laws. It has to be that it is a false statement claiming to be true, something that is not true, all right? It has to be a public communication of the statement, not just something you say privately, okay? And then there has to be fault amounting to at least negligent. And what that, because I was just curious about what all these things, because everything in the article I was looking at was like hyperlinked with extra definitions and all this other stuff. And I'm not a lawyer, nor the son of a lawyer. But the negligence they're talking about is failure to behave with a level of care that someone of ordinary prudence would have exercised under the same circumstances. Were they behaving in a way that's consistent with what we think they should be in that situation? Or were they being negligent? And then lastly, there must be damage or harm that results from this. All right? And I'm pretty sure I pulled this off Cornell. Sorry for not putting a footnote. But these 4 things have to do with defaming one's character in our legal system. We're going to slightly talk about what it was for the Jews, but there's definitely aspects of this that were being used for Christians. They wanted, first of all, they were making false statements, but they were making public communications of these statements. In a collectivistic culture where you live with possibly 2 to 3 to 4 generations of your family, the worst thing that you could have happen is public communications of things that are bad. Because if you're the young one, and we look at the prodigal son, the parable of that, he would have not just said that he was kind of kissing his family goodbye and didn't care about them, his father and his inheritance, but his entire family. He did not care to take care of them, to help them in any way. He was just to go. And that would have resulted in some public communications of what he did and the kind of individual he was. Now, that would have been just. But what Jesus is saying is that blessed are you, Christians, when you have people that make false statements about you in a very not serious way. There was a student who wasn't doing what they're supposed to, and I was getting on to them because I had nothing better to do than to be petty in the way that I wanted them to follow the rules like they're supposed to. And so upon being talked to about this later, they said, I quote, cussed them out up and down. And when I referred this statement to one of my administrators, they were like, you don't swear at all, Mr. Rominske. And I was like, uh-huh. And so, like, to me, that was like a moment of someone saying something false that was very minor. And yet it wasn't being true. But there are so many things. And I think that Johnny Depp case is one of them you could look to as that. But people were trying to do this to the Christians in the first century world. They didn't want to just discredit them. They wanted to bring shame on their families as a result of serving Christ. Because, I mean, keep in mind, they are technically, breaking away from the law. I mean, we know they're fulfilling the law, but in the eyes of the Jews, they're kind of stomping on everything that their culture stands for. And they were to do that publicly, and they were trying to bring harm. That brings us back to the physical and emotional harm part, because they definitely did try to physically harm them. And we talked about Saul and the things he did. He tried to physically harm Christians as a result of that, to bring harm about that. And I think that's really challenging because, did I just duplicate this slide? That's nice. Did I triplicate this slide? Wow, that's a lot of statements. All right, great. So when we look, though, at those 4 things, I want us to keep in mind how those things apply, or how we can see those things apply in our lives. It's weird to think about it like this. This is probably the closest we'll get to a lot of those instances, because people aren't waiting to throw us in a small pit and chuck rocks down at us until we're dead. Then they did that to Christians, to ruin their witness and to, hurt their ties. And I mean, you think how you would respond if one of your close family members was trying to talk to you about the way and then proceeded to have been stoned the next day. You probably are not going to be as apt to listen to whatever your family member was telling you now that they have been promptly executed. It's just a challenge. And kudos to our brothers and sisters in the first century for enduring that, because we wouldn't be here without them saying, I'm willing to endure both emotional and physical harm for Jesus. And I think that's also a statement to the power of Jesus' witness and to the apostles, that they were willing to do what they did. And as we talked about it is interesting to see the different traditions they have for all those apostles, but I don't like to think about that. We move on also to the idea of persecuting. And this is the same word that Danny talked about last week. All right, dioko, or persecution. And it has the idea of, as he said, to put to flight and also to drive away. And that idea of driving away is one very seen in a very small way as we look at Jesus and his family, where it says they took flight to Egypt. And if you look at the way that the ESV heads it, it says flight to Egypt on the top. This is a being pushed out of where you're supposed to be. And as Jason was saying, the Christians in James that were talking about that, they were pushed away from their homelands. They were persecuted. They were pushed out. Those kind of things. Now, I don't think they're going to be pushing us out of Madison anytime soon. But we could find ourselves socially and emotionally pushed out of things. And with that, I guess there's a few questions. How can we be blessed when we are driven away from things? Just driven away from social situations, whether it be opportunities, something like that. How can we be blessed when we are driven away?
So as a believer, all trials and tribulations have a divine. So if we're being driven away, it's for a reason. We may not know the answer to that. We may not be able to see it right then. And I like using those two words, divine, better than blessing. Because blessing is really hard to record when, but if you think of it as a divine purpose, there's some reason why this is happening to you. You don't know the answer to it, but it's eventually you'll see God. And to know that the outcome is you will eventually see God because of what's going on. It's encouragement to me. And so if you're driven away, you're being driven away for a reason. You be there, maybe there's the wrong people, maybe it's the wrong crowd, maybe you don't need money, whatever it is. But there's a divine purpose in it. So,
And I mean, even if anybody had challenges or thinks about also the idea that there isn't exactly how Sonny phrased it, I will say that no matter what you think about those situations, if their every purpose is divinely purposed or not, one thing as Christians we cannot argue about is that we serve a God that is so powerful and so mighty that he will bring glory no matter the situation you find yourself in. It doesn't matter. And so whether you see that as divine purpose for those things being divinely purposed, I can guarantee you that if you believe in the power of God, you believe that glory will come from any situation.
not look back, right? You're being driven away. What are you being driven to? Right? What's ahead of you? Would the church have spread in the first century with that persecution and then not driven out? Right? What are you going to do when you get there?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's great because we can't be tied to our comfort so much that we fail to be a witness. Because if we refuse to be driven, then we are choosing something over something divine. Now, it's not to say we shouldn't stand our ground as individuals, but we shouldn't refuse to be moved away from things simply because we like them.
Look at each one of the Christian dispersions. That's when the church grew. That's when the faith grew. And the same thing's true today. It grows when we are persecuted. That gives us an interest of life, maybe.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't wish suffering on myself, certainly, or on any of us. But like we said, it's going to happen. We will endure things. And so we might as well just, put on our big Christian pants and grow from them instead of trying to avoid them.
To say, and actually, do something more. That you're trying to grow up as an adult. It's so bad. And so my wife will tell you how bad it is to be married to someone who's insecure and unexperienced in so many things. I do everything in the world, and I do college, and so it was tough. And all along the way, it's like, well, I never expect them to crawl in houses already. I did that at one point after the posting, so it pushed me out after an injury, blah, blah, blah. But the point is that he pushed me hard, and he expected more of me. Let me suffer more then. My adult life was so much smoother than life was. It's back to God loving us enough to let us fall and together, stay out there, maybe be abused a little bit and say, well, what are you gonna do about that? What God have you do? I have some experiences that are challenging. To mention the AOM podcast from her. My youngest son, he says we take bad feelings, so now I have it, you put it on my phone. You can go there and you'll find some things that are very interesting. People are starting to discover that if they'll go and let somebody drop them into the forest somewhere and spend a week or alone, something happens within you. It gives you amazing confidence and ability to survive. These are just natural things that happen, some things in life. So by insulating all of our children and grandchildren, I'm concerned about that. If we're seeing it now, they don't know how to interact and how to take anything. If we put it into a solution for anything, I mean, the way that things Bible. It's a sad thing not to be maturing with some suffering. As somebody mentioned, there's good reasons why God does. I don't think there's a single thing that's indifferent to happen to a praying person. So I felt shattered by not ended, my whole career was over, post service, blah, blah, blah. They don't have no insurance or anything until the company gave me something. And all they had was it. But that was not by chance, it was from the beginning. So we get to know that. So we teach our kids that too, the sense that that's because God allowed it. We try to follow God and allow that for it.
Yeah. I mean, we need to try not to avoid those things and come of that. And I want to leave you with these takeaways, is that part of the cost of being a Christian is persecution or suffering. And our debt, our reward outweighs our debt, I should say. And our reward outweighs the cost. I just flipped it. That's what happened. My bad. Now, our debt is much, much more than we can repay. And the reward outweighs our debt, which should show you how great our reward is. But the reward also outweighs the cost. Being a Christian, and I really hope that you internalize that being a Christian isn't something that costs you more than you get. You get far more than what it costs you. And that is very hard to believe when you are in the depths of despair and suffering. And with that, if we hold on to the comforts of this life more than we hold on to Christ, we will not be able to be blessed. And as your action step, I just ask you to seek discomfort in the way that you live. That you are trying not to just find the most comfortable way to be a Christian, but finding the most effective way to serve Christ. Thank you.